Could you all be seated, please? What? All right, Assalamu alaikum. The event will start in a few minutes. If you all could just find yourself a seat, that would be great. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. All right, Assalamu alaikum for the third time. While we wait for our second speaker, I'm just going to give you guys a quick announcement. On behalf of Zakat Foundation, MYG, and AMP, we're going to be having a fundraiser tomorrow night from 6 to 8 for Gaza here at ISOC. Tickets are $25 per person, and food will be passed out by volunteers tomorrow, inshallah. It would mean a lot for you all to attend, especially since we're having a lecture on Palestine. So, as a way to act upon what you learned today, come to the fundraiser, inshallah. Again, it's $25 per person, and inshallah, we see you all there. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
So, assalamu alaikum everyone for the fourth time, this time from me, so technically first time. We hope you all are doing well on this wonderful Friday night, and that you guys are all just as excited as we are for tonight's program. My name is Maryam. I'm going to be your guys' host for tonight's event, and tonight's event, if you guys didn't know already, is the history of Palestine and Israel, a history of colonization and apartheid. So, as you all may know, there has been a recent outbreak of violence as a result of Israel's ongoing and continuous efforts to ethnically displace Palestinians from their homes. And while it is essential to stay updated on what is currently happening in Palestine on a day-to-day basis, it is also equally important to understand the origins of what lead to today's current present-day situation in Palestine. And that starts from pre-1948 to today's ethnic cleansing efforts by Israel, by their operations that are not only currently violating international law, but also violating Palestinians' fundamental human rights. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two keynote speakers for tonight's program. First off, Estee Chandler, who founded the LA chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace in 2010 and is currently on JVP's board of directors and chairs of the board of JVP's sister organization, JVP Action. And she's also the host and producer of KPFK's Middle East in Focus. And next up, our second keynote speaker is Shaheen Nassar. He is CAIR-LA's current policy and advocacy coordinator, where he advocates for solutions on policy issues that impact not only the Muslim community, but Americans in general. And he has been a political activist for several years for various human rights as well as global justice causes, and frequently hosts these kind of workshops and teach-ins on social justice issues. So I'm going to hand over the mic to our keynote speakers to start off tonight's event.
Hey everyone. So because we're starting late, I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to start off by speaking a bit about Zionism and anti-Zionism as a way of sort of leveling the ground upon which Shaheen and I are going to set our foundation and build our conversation tonight about Palestine-Israel, a history of colonization and apartheid. So JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, is guided by a vision of justice, equality, and freedom for all people. So we unequivocally oppose Zionism because it's counter to those ideals. Zionism is a 20th century political ideology that emerged in a time when Jews were defined as irrevocably outside of a Christian Europe. European anti-Semitism threatened and ended millions of Jewish lives in pogroms, in exile, and in the Holocaust. And we realize that for many Jews, opposing Zionism or even discussing it can be painful and can strike at their deepest trauma and greatest fears. And if we all understand that, it'll make us better advocates. At the same time, many Jews have come to see that Zionism was a false and failed answer to the very real question many of our ancestors faced about how to protect Jewish lives from murderous anti-Semitism in early 20th century Europe. But Zionism was and is a racist response to a racist problem that didn't just emerge as one Jewish response to anti-Semitism, it was part and parcel of European imperialism. It received British support in part because it sought to create a colonial outpost at the crossroads of Asia and Africa on the shores of the Mediterranean, nestled between three major continents. While earlier forms of Zionism espoused multinational and binational possibilities, by the time the State of Israel was formed and founded, the dominant expression of Zionism was and remains an ethnocentric, settler colonial, apartheid state where Jews are primary citizens and others are secondary or tertiary citizens. This all in spite of Jewish history having already taught people how dangerous that could be. Zionism, the political movement that first sought to create a state of, by, and for Jews exclusively, and the realization of that quest, the creation of Israel, has not only led to a racist hierarchy amongst the Jews living in Palestine, Israel, it's also been a tool used to break the ties of Jewish communities living in Arab lands, from Tunisia to Egypt and Yemen to Iraq. Another outgrowth of the Zionist project was and continues to be the denigration of peoples, cultures, and ways of life in the Swana region. Zionists bombed synagogues in Iraq and Tunisia, and later in the 1980s, during the Lebanese War, in which both Israel and the US were directly implicated, the Palestine Liberation Organization stood guard in front of Lebanese synagogues in the Jewish quarter to protect them. But later, they would be destroyed by Zionist bombs. These bomb attacks targeted those buildings specifically to ensure that Jews had no safe haven in their native countries in order to drive them to Palestine. And as the Jewish American political theorist Hannah Arendt, widely considered one of the most important political thinkers of the 20th century, described in detail during World War II, Zionists also allied with Nazi leaders and conspired against the Jewish resistance leaders in Warsaw to guarantee the rupture of Jewish continuity in Europe, and again, to drive Jews to Palestine. While white supremacy and white nationalism are by far the greatest drivers of anti-Semitism today, I would argue that the actions and policies of the Zionist state of Israel fuels anti-Semitism around the world. As Israeli writer Gideon Levy wrote in Haaretz, it's leftism or Zionism. You cannot have both. And because Israel is not, never was, and cannot be both a liberal democracy and a Jewish state, many people are now identifying as anti-Zionist. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has claimed that the idea that all other peoples can seek and defend the right to self-determination, but Jews cannot, is anti-Semitic because he says it denies to Jews what every other people enjoys. But that's a lie. Anti-Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic, and claiming that it is actually uses Jewish suffering to erase Palestinian experience. I mean, how dumb does he think we are? Many people don't have their own state, right? Yet nobody's heard Chuck Schumer suggesting that opposing a Kurdish, Tibetan, or Catalan state makes you an anti-Kurdish, anti-Tibetan, or anti-Catalan bigot. And you might think that Jewish leaders and members of Congress would understand that, because most of those same leaders, Jewish and otherwise, who call national self-determination a universal right, are perfectly comfortable denying it to Palestinians. Further, at a time when anti-Semitism is actually rising, including here in the United States, it's astonishing to see so many politicians responding to it, not by taking steps to make Jewish people safe or to protect Jews, but instead by victimizing Palestinians, as is the case with the over 30 state anti-BDS laws now in effect. The controversial International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, working definition of anti-Semitism that is being pushed for usage by Israel lobby organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, Jewish federations, and the Jewish Community Relations Council falsely includes among its contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, quote, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, end quote. In other words, it claims that anti-Zionism is hatred of Jews. And I want to be very clear, it is not. The IHRA definition completely fails to capture or identify the true nature of anti-Semitism and its root causes. Use of that definition does nothing to make Jewish people safe. Instead, it poses a direct threat to Palestinians, Palestinian rights activists, and free speech. And it has become a core tool of the Israel lobby to silence Palestinians and prevent people like us from holding the Israeli government accountable. Governments and media outlets should refuse any attempts to codify the definition or to use it as a guiding factor in law or practice. And it's our job to make sure that they know that. The ways that Zionism has targeted Palestinian people is not ancient history. Zionism remains the basis for Israel's government structure and rule over Palestinians. Zionism is the foundation for what is happening in Palestine and Israel today, and helps us better understand both Israel's systematic efforts to dispossess Palestinians of their lands, homes, and rights, and the US and Western colonial governments' continued failure to address the decades of gross violations of Palestinian human rights under a settler colonial apartheid regime. Thank you.
I believe we're going to take a quick break so that we can pray Maghrib, and inshallah we'll resume the program. Thank you so much, Estee.
Thank you, Shaheen.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sisters, if they want to stay in the main prayer hall, they could pray in the back. There's a lot of chairs there. You can move it around. If you want to pray in the next room, you can do so.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. استووا استقيموا. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. إنما التوبة على الله للذين يعملون السوء بجهالة ثم يتوبون من قريب فأولئك يتوب الله عليهم وكان الله عليما حكيما. وليست التوبة للذين يعملون السيئات حتى إذا حضر أحدهم الموت قال إني تبت الآن ولا الذين يموتون وهم كفار أولئك أعتدنا لهم عذابا أليما. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. الضالين. القارعة ما القارعة وما أدراك ما القارعة يوم يكون الناس كالفراش المبثوث وتكون الجبال كالعهن المنفوش فأما من ثقلت موازينه فهو في عيشة راضية وأما من خفت موازينه فأمه هاوية وما أدراك ما هي نار حامية. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your prayers. Today we're having an historical event on Palestine right after your sunnahs. So if you all could stick around and please attend. This is an event that has a lot of information regarding Palestine. And yeah, we're glad to see you all here. Inshallah, if you guys could attend, that would be great. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
there you go.
All right, Assalamu alaikum everyone. I hope you all are doing well. For those of you who are just joining us following prayer, MRG is currently hosting an event, and it's on Palestine and Israel, which is a history of colonization and apartheid. So that is currently taking place. We started off with touching base on Zionism from an anti-Zionist Jewish perspective. So that's what we've covered so far, just to give you guys a bit of an update. And from here on out, we will be touching base and doing so with the history of Palestine through a Palestinian perspective. And from then onwards, we'll be shifting the conversation more towards Palestine's present-day reality, and that way to kind of establish the connection between past and present, and illustrating the effects of Zionism today, and how that is evident with Israel's basically efforts of dispossessing Palestinians from not only their lands, but their homes and their own rights, and also the US's failures of acknowledging the violation of those things. So we will be continuing the conversation. For those of you guys who may have questions that might come to mind throughout the event, we will be hosting a Q&A session towards the end, so please keep your questions in mind until then. We will be beginning the conversation, so I'll have our speakers take it away.
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So as Estee and I were talking earlier, inshallah, this is going to be a delightfully messy, but very informational and educational experience. So this is a very heavy topic, and we were sort of asked to provide a somewhat comprehensive understanding of the situation. So we're going to do our best to do that within the time constraints that we have. And to be very frank, it would probably be very difficult for us to provide a very in-depth discussion of all the facts and all, like every event. So what we're going to do is essentially provide you with a SparkNotes version of history, so to speak, sort of a summarized, abbreviated understanding to counter the vile colonial narratives that are saturating the discussion on Palestine. So, going off of what my wonderful colleague Estee just said, we're essentially going to discuss the situation of Palestinians before the Nakba, after the Nakba, the current realities. We also want to discuss some of the things that y'all could do in response to the situation, so that we're basically, we don't want to be just spectators of history. We have a rare opportunity. We have one of the most important social justice and racial justice issues of our time, and we have the opportunity to be on the right side of history. Not only that, but as many of you all know, that Masjid al-Aqsa is a waqf. It's held in trust for the Muslims. And what that means is it's not yours to necessarily barter or give away or for us to betray Palestinians or anything like that. What that means is we all have a moral obligation to contribute to its defense, to contribute to the defense of this sacred land, and to ensure that justice and equity prevail. That being said, actually it was, I mentioned briefly the Nakba. The Nakba is basically the catastrophe, and a very interesting observation a friend of mine had made. So a friend of mine is a PhD candidate at the University of Riverside, California, and he's studying and focusing on Native American studies. And he noticed that I don't know if y'all keep up with Netflix and Hulu and all these movies and films, but for the past decade, what has dominated the airwaves is a lot of this fascination, this morbid fascination with a post-apocalyptic future. From Mad Max to right now they have Sweet Tooth and The Army of the Dead and The Walking Dead and all these pop culture expressions and this morbid obsession with post-apocalyptic societies. Something that he noted was that for many indigenous people, including Palestinians, in a way, we've already experienced a huge catastrophic event. We've already experienced, in a sense, a post-apocalyptic scenario. So, you know, there's this fascination with what exists beyond an enormous catastrophe. And, you know, for many indigenous folks, as I mentioned, including Palestinians, we're living in a situation in which many of our people are incarcerated, many of our people have been killed, our land has been confiscated. So it's just very interesting that you have Western cultural fascination with this subject that's almost parroting our experience. Yeah, it's very interesting. So some of what I'm going to do is me and Estee are going to go back and forth discussing some of these important historical events. But other things that I wanted to discuss before we get into it is to have a basic understanding of some concepts. So for example, I want to discuss the concept of colonization. Colonization is essentially when a group A takes the land and from group B. But the problem with colonization is not just about the land, it's what the theft of the land implies. So among group A, you have people that would not steal, that recognize each other as human beings and therefore recognize the limitations of that relationship. So the implication that because they can steal the land of group A, can steal the land of group B, the implication is that they do not recognize group B as human in the same capacity that they recognize themselves. That they see group B as subhuman. And that is the implied racism behind settler colonial land theft. So that's what we're talking about, colonization. So whenever we talk about Palestine, it's not a war, it's not a conflict, it's not a battle, because these words imply a struggle between two equally morally responsible and two equally powerful parties. The reality is we have a situation of racial apartheid. We have a situation of ethnic cleansing. We have a situation of genocide. We have a situation of settler colonization. And again, I'm going to go into some of these terms in a bit. Another thing I wanted to confront sort of before we get into the historical facts is the power dynamics that exist in discussing this. So for example, there's often the accusation of anti-Semitism. And another thing that's neglected from the conversation is that Palestinians and Arabs are Semites themselves. That anti-Semitism is, throughout much of history, a uniquely European phenomenon. It was essentially a way of saying, it was a way of persecuting a group of people for the false historical accusation, this false historical allegation that they had descended from historic Palestine. The reality, of course, is, as most historians recognize, that much of European Jews and much of the European Jewish colonizers of Palestine are all descendants of medieval converts to Judaism. And that realistically, the blood of the ancient Israelites most likely flows in the blood of Palestinians that were there, so within the Palestinian Muslim, Jewish, and Christian community. Another thing that isn't often known is that there was, and still is, a Palestinian Jewish community. And when Zionism happened, they were overwhelmingly anti-Zionist. And that's important to note. And another thing I want to mention is that Palestinians, I kind of hinted at it before, but Palestinians aren't indigenous people. So our plight is similar to the plight of Native Americans, similar to the plight of the Maori of New Zealand, of the Aborigines of Australia. And what that means is, to be indigenous isn't that you fulfill some stereotype about Native American people, but rather that your people have an ongoing and continuous tango with a colonial system. And another thing I also wanted to mention, since we're on the topic, is that Palestinians, I'm sorry, forgive me. Since we're on the topic, I also want to recognize that this is Tongva and Kauai land, and that I cannot, in good conscience, advocate for the liberation of Palestine without advocating that the Muslim community needs to make these connections with the indigenous communities here. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get out of your house and, abandon it. What we're saying is we need to do more for the indigenous communities. They're here. They may not be visible in mainstream media, but they are here, and we need to reach out and see what we can do to remedy the situation of American settler colonization towards these people. So another thing I also want to address is that some of the contradictions. So Zionism is a racial supremacist ideology. It is a political ideology, but as I mentioned, all settler colonial ideas, they have an implied racism. That the people, the indigenous people, the native people, they don't matter. You can kill them, you can exploit them. In fact, usually I describe the treatment of indigenous people with the 3 E's: extermination, expulsion, and exploitation. Use them as a cheap source of labor, kill them, or just basically kick them out because you do not recognize that they have equal right to co-inhabit the same land as the colonizer. So that being said, there's lots of interesting contradictions. For example, if Zionism is a supremacist ideology, isn't ironic that also Jews are the targets? And by the way, this is legitimate. Anti-Semitism is a real thing. I may not necessarily agree with its relevance to the issue of Palestine, but anti-Semitism is a very real thing, and there are white supremacists out there who hold Jewish lives and Muslim lives and Palestinian lives with equal contempt. So I just wanted to let you know that if you notice these contradictions within white supremacy, know that it's no fault of your own. The reason why these contradictions exist is because white supremacy and racism generally are illogical and nonsensical ideologies. So if you notice these contradictions, don't be alarmed. It's just confirmation that you are sane. And as I mentioned, that race is a social construct. It's made up. People can literally make it on any distinction, whether real or imagined. And so what we're witnessing in historic Palestine is a racial hierarchy, sort of like a pyramid scheme a caste system in which we hierarchize the value of human life based on their ethnic or religious identity, in which Palestinians often arguably occupy the lowest rung of that racial hierarchy. The other thing I want to mention, very briefly, and forgive me, Estee, you've been very patient. I was just going to say...
Oh, I'm learning.
Thank you. I was going to say that, forgive me, hopefully this isn't a crude example for the setting that we're in. Just curious, I'm assuming some of us are fans of Italian mafia movies. I'd like to think so. Okay, very cool. I got one dude in the back. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
I am Sicilian.
There we go. So what I was going to say is settler colonial societies like the United States, like Israel, like Australia, like New Zealand, when they take over a land and try to get rid of the native population, they sort of operate similar in the way that we imagine the mafia does. They don't like to leave witnesses. So the idea is that whatever settler colonial society will always continuously be committed to the eradication of the indigenous population. The reason being, so long as we exist, we are a living, breathing threat to their sovereignty. We're a reminder that they came, and the only way that they have our land is by killing our ancestors and committing unspeakable atrocities. And these are morally and intellectual unsound ways of territorial acquisition. So the idea is, in the future, there could be an international governing body that could hold the U.S. and Israel accountable. And so long as we exist, we present a threat that justice could prevail. And so if we're no longer in the picture, we no longer threaten their sovereignty. And so that is why settler colonial ideologies are inherently dedicated to the annihilation of the indigenous population. And with that, I'm going to do my best to just me and Estee are going to go back and forth discussing some of these big topics. So yeah, I wanted to discuss, so we discussed the catastrophe, the Nakba. I mentioned it briefly. I kind of want to go and talk about some of the facts that happened before that. So very briefly, Palestine was actually under Ottoman rule until 1917. And in 1917, basically the Ottomans lost World War I, and the Europeans, in the tradition of their colonial empires, divvied up what we call the Middle East, but what is more correctly known as SWANA, the Southwest Asia, North Africa. and they colonized Palestine. And unfortunately, the British, and I should also mention that this is when we start seeing the fruition of Zionism as an ideology. We start seeing the arrival in the, I want to say, I could be off by a couple of years, but I was going to say in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we see the arrival of Zionist colonizers. And originally, one of the things that they were doing was buying a portion of the land, but realizing that buying, that this was not a feasible or realistic or practical means of acquiring the homeland that they had envisioned, it began to escalate into atrocities, to put it simply. And there's lots of things that happened during this period, but again, for the sake of time, I'm gonna kind of like breeze through it. And we start seeing, for example, this open contempt, this genocidal contempt for the indigenous population. So basically, in order to start to get villagers, Palestinians to flee, they began creating massacres. And I think I mentioned a notable Israeli historian who actually mentioned that sometimes the Zionists would go into a village and grab 10 children and have them in the middle of the village and execute them publicly in order to generate the fear and terror that caused Palestinians to flee. And that this sort of culminated in what we call the Nakba, the largest ethnic cleansing operation. And forgive me for not saying it earlier, a description of this was that Palestinians were racially unfit to share the same land. That, as Estee had mentioned, Zionism was a racially exclusive project, similar as how the United States was originally a racially exclusive project. And the point was to eradicate the existence of Palestinians. And in 1948, this sort of hit a crescendo, kind of hit a high note, where 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from Palestine. And some estimates say that tens of thousands of people had died during this time in really brutal ways. For example, again, allow me to, forgive me, I didn't give a trigger warning. Some of the things I'm going to describe are a little bit more graphic, so inshallah, I'm going to try to keep it as PG as possible. But one of the things I wanted to mention was Dir Yassin. Dir Yassin is a very infamous village because Zionist settlers would, in order to spare bullets, they would sometimes take the head of children and bash it against rocks. Apparently, we were not worth the ammunition. But I just want to give you sort of an example of the brutality and the contempt of life that Palestinians experienced during this time, and that this would escalate later on. Actually, before I go any further, Estee, is there something that you would love to add to?
I just want to add that is this too loud? Okay. So there was actually a plan, and it was called Plan Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Plan ABCD. And what Shaheen is describing is Plan Daled. It was the plan to ethnically cleanse the land. And over 500 Palestinian towns and villages were eradicated. And so the reason why there's so many stories is because not the exact same thing happened in every place. Different things happened. In some places, the communities had very good relationships, and they said, go away, come back, we'll call for you when it's safe, it's not safe for you. And then, of course, they were never let back. And some of those people were being honest, and some of them weren't. Like, different things happened in all these places, but it was all horrific.
No, thank you. Yeah, it was. And so what we start to see at this point, so 1948 is the inception of the Israeli state. To put it very, to try to summarize it as best as I can, the state of Israel, through the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population, established itself as a state and began this pattern of continuous ethnic cleansing. That's another thing I'd like to talk about. When we talk about racism, this is generally about racism, but this also applies to Palestine or any other racial justice issue that you can think of. Settler colonization, racism, slavery, I mean, a lot of these things are not static. They're not moments in history, they're ongoing processes, and we still see the echoes and reverberations of these events today. So a lot of the people that were massacring Palestinians, the people that I mentioned who would kill in such horrific and gruesome ways Palestinian children, committed acts of sexual violence. These death squads, the Irgun, the Haganah, Kaf al-Aswad, the Black Hand, they would later evolve into the modern Israeli Defense Forces. So what I was going to say is another point I wanted to make also, that this is speaking generally about white supremacy, that white supremacy is not a static ideology. It's constantly evolving and adapting. And so groups that were previously excluded from white supremacy can be accepted today, or annexed by white supremacy. So for example, groups like Italians, Irish people, and Jews, people previously excluded by whiteness, can now be accepted into this, racial country club of whiteness. However, what I do want to say is that anti-Semitism, again, is very real and still exists within white supremacy, and that you have competing ideologies of white supremacy. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I did want to mention, since I'm remembering it, that there is a version of white supremacy, for example, I think it was an Australian, I forget who it was, I think it was the Australian ambassador to Israel, who basically said, hey, we're two white settler colonial nations among a sea of colored people. We have a lot in common. So there is this ideology that recognizes Israel as, the democratic outpost, an extension of Western civilization in a barbaric land. And there is a white supremacy that deals with that, and we'll get to that more. But I was going to say, Estee.
Yeah, I want to jump off that and talk a little bit about apartheid, a word that we're starting to hear. We've been saying it for a long time, but we're hearing it accepted more, and it's important to understand it so that if you get accused of being wrong, you know how to deal with it. So, as the Human Rights Watch recent report, A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution, clearly lays out, about 6.8 million Jewish Israelis and 6.8 million Palestinians live today between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, in an area encompassing Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, the latter made up of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. Throughout most of this area, Israel is the sole governing power. In the remainder, it exercises primary authority alongside limited Palestinian self-rule. Across those areas, in most aspects of life, Israeli authorities methodically privilege Jewish Israelis and discriminate against Palestinians. Laws, policies, and statements by leading Israeli officials make plain that the objective of maintaining Jewish-Israeli control over demographics, political power, and land has long guided Israel's government policy. In pursuit of that goal, authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, and subjugated Palestinians by virtue of their identity to varying degrees of intensity. In certain areas, as described in the Human Rights Watch report, these deprivations are so severe that they amount to crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. Several widely held assumptions, including that the occupation is temporary, that the peace process will soon bring an end to the Israeli abuses, that Palestinians have meaningful control over their lives in the West Bank and Gaza, and that Israel is an egalitarian democracy inside its borders, have obscured the reality of Israel's entrenched discriminatory rule over Palestinians. Israel has maintained military rule over some portion of Palestinian population for all but 6 months of its 73-year history. It did so over the vast majority of Palestinians inside Israel from 1948 to 1967, and from until 1966, and from 1967 until present, it has militarily ruled over Palestinians in the occupied territories, excluding East Jerusalem. By contrast, it has since its founding governed over all Jewish Israelis, including settlers in the occupied territories, since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, under its more rights-respecting civil law. For the past 54 years, Israeli authorities have facilitated the transfer of Jewish Israelis into the occupied territories and granted them a superior status under the law as compared to Palestinians living in the same territory when it comes to civil rights, access to land, and freedom to move, build, and confer residency rights to close relatives. While Palestinians have a limited degree of self-rule in parts of the occupied territory, Israel remains retains primary control over borders, airspace, movement of people and goods, security, and the registry of the entire population, which in turn dictates such matters as legal status and eligibility to receive identity cards. A number of Israeli officials have stated clearly that their intent to maintain this control in perpetuity and backed it up through their actions, including continued settlement expansion over the course of this decades-long peace process, unilateral annexation of additional parts of the West Bank, which the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to carry out, would formalize the reality of systematic Israeli domination and oppression that has long prevailed without changing the reality that the entire West Bank is occupied territory under the international law of occupation, including East Jerusalem, which Israel unilaterally annexed in 1967. So apartheid is not just a slur that we toss out to piss people off. It's actually a legal construct and has been. And if you read the phrasing of it in the UN Charter, you will see it describes Israel to a T.
Absolutely. Yeah, so as Estee just mentioned, the word apartheid isn't a parody. It's not an analogy that we're using, as Noam Chomsky once put it, he described it for years that the treatment of Palestinians had not risen to the benevolence of South African apartheid. And what I mean by that is that South African apartheid was extremely ugly and racist and violent, but that the treatment of Palestinians was still further behind that. Now, let me qualify that statement. I'm just trying to impress upon you how severe the conditions that Palestinians are experiencing. I don't actually believe that we should ever sort of treat people's struggles or oppression as a competition. In fact, if you're belittling someone's struggle in order to draw more attention to your own, it's a zero net gain. No one benefits from that. So again, I'm not belittling the suffering of South African people, and I recognize it as a shared struggle with Palestinians. However, I'm just saying some of the things that notable intellects have mentioned about Israeli apartheid, that it consists of segregated roads, segregated buses, segregated educational systems, segregated governing systems, as Estee just mentioned. And although it formally ended, well, I can't even say that, because even within the Palestinian citizens of Israel itself, so there's, we need to clarify this. So there's Palestinians living within the occupied territories, which are essentially very large reservations, ghettos in which Palestinians are confined to. And then we also have the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So a very small portion of Palestinians were given Israeli citizens, but are disadvantaged in almost every conceivable political, economic, and social juncture. And these group of people also, I've witnessed it firsthand, experience a heavy level of cultural repression. And so there's almost, what I'm sensing is almost a fear to express that one is Palestinian. So for example, there's even anti-race mixing laws within the state of Israel. Maybe not laws that explicitly punish race mixing, but that make it illegal for a Palestinian man to court an Israeli woman without confiding his racial or ethnic identity. And you know, the implication is that to be Palestinian is somehow criminalized in the state of Israel.
Can I just add one point?
Yeah, please.
In many Israeli towns, they have laws saying Palestinians can't live here. Like, they're allowed to just say, no Palestinians. It's that blatantly racist.
One poll indicates that 40% of Israelis consider Palestinians culturally inferior, and another poll indicated that 70%, just as you had just mentioned, would refuse to allow a Palestinian to live in their neighborhood or to live on their street. Another thing is, I want to talk about some of the disparities that exist between the residents of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Israeli Jews that also live there. So one of the things is access to water. So some villages in the West Bank have only hours of access to water, whereas you'll see some illegal settlements, and we'll discuss the settlements and what that means in a second.
All the settlements are illegal. Sorry.
No, not at all. Absolutely. And you'll see these illegal settlements, which have a very vile purpose, as having flowing lawns and, flowing pools and green lawns. So basically they have an, what's the word? They can use water freely, whereas in the occupied territories, water, medicine, freedom of movement, access to important necessities is very limited. And it's a completely different, more severe situation in Gaza. But before we continue, I want to talk about the settlement program. So you might turn on the news and you'll hear something about, settlements expanded in East Jerusalem today, as if it was a normal thing. So the very premise of the settlements, could you, maybe some of you, this is a rhetorical question, but some of y'all can guess, what would the purpose of kicking out a Palestinian family in order to replace them by a Euro-American Israeli Jewish family? What would the purpose of that be? The purpose is ethnic cleansing. The settlement program is a state-sponsored ethnic cleansing program that uses and relies on public Israeli participation. The most racist elements of Israeli society, the most violent elements of Israeli societies are literally encouraged and armed to kick out Palestinians from their home for the purpose of removing undesirables. So that's the other thing that we have to sort of get out in the open, is that when I say that Israel envisions itself as a Jewish state, it means so in an ethnic sense, in an ethnically exclusive sense, meaning that anyone who is not Jewish is undesirable. And therefore, there is an elaborate system of ways to evict, to kill, and to eradicate Palestinians. And did you want to mention?
I have this great story that hooks into news that we've all been watching. So, as Shaheen's saying, the Zionist movement has always aimed to establish a greater Israel, meaning all of historic Palestine. As discussed, Israel is a product of a national settler colonial project, right? The settler colonial state's distinguishing feature is that it doesn't come into being and cannot continue to exist without claiming sovereignty over the land that is forcefully taken from its native inhabitants. So in short, the settler colony can only claim its sovereignty through the eradication and erasure of native sovereignty. The annexation plan is nothing more than the state's turn to claim sovereignty over what the settlers have already annexed. And they are able to annex precisely because the state makes that possible through their occupation of Palestinian land. So recently, Yaakov Fauci became notorious for his presence in a viral video discussing his theft of a portion of the El Kurd home in Sheikh Jarrah, right? But Yaakov is actually a federally charged con artist from Long Island named Justin Fauci. Thanks to intrepid journalism, we now know that it's Justin Fauci in his New York accent telling Muna al-Kurd, if I don't steal it, someone else is gonna steal it, in that viral video. In addition to support for Trump and COVID-19 conspiracies, the report also exposed that Fauci is a supporter of the far-right fascist Rabbi Meir Kahane, having shared quotes and articles from Kahane on his Facebook page. So Meir Kahane was a Brooklyn-based rabbi who founded the Jewish Defense League, or JDL, in 1968. Kahane advocated that each and every single Jewish person should migrate to Israel, that non-Jews should not be allowed citizenship of the State of Israel, and that Israel should annex the West Bank and Gaza and expel all the Palestinians living there. Kahane asserted that Zionism and democracy are at odds, and that the idea of a democratic Jewish state is nonsense. Okay, on the last point, I agree with him. But another follower of Kahane was Baruch Goldstein, a Brooklyn-based doctor who in 1994 murdered 29 Palestinians and injured 125 more while they were praying in the Ibrahimi Mosque in the West Bank city of Hebron. But what's noteworthy about Justin Fauci is he didn't grow up in Israel. He grew up in Long Island. He studied at Brandeis University. He was involved in American Jewish communal activities. Think about it. If an American from Long Island were to join a militant or extremist group, the question that would be asked is, what radicalized him? In the case of Fauci, we should ask that question. What radicalized him? How dehumanized are Palestinians in mainstream American discourse that someone can grow up for nearly 3 decades in the United States, embrace the teachings of Meir Kahane, and think that it is okay to go and steal somebody's home? Fauci is not an isolated incident. Meir Kahane was American. Baruch Goldstein was an American. So what is it about the way our country portrays Palestinians that some of the most violent, deadly, and pernicious figures who terrorize Palestinians come from the United States? I'll just finish by saying that Max Blumenthal surmises in his report about this, quote, in many respects, the communal spaces that Fauci lived in through his life are responsible for what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah today. Many see the Israeli occupation as an international issue very far away. But what Justin Fauci, in all of his aloofness, shows is that the Israeli occupation is an American issue. And I'll just note that in 2015, 15% of the settlers were American. And I would venture to guess that in 2021, that number is close to double. Our money, our government, what are we going to do about it?
100%. And just to clarify, when we're talking about Fauci, we're talking about the portly guy who tried to steal the home of some Palestinians, not the mousy guy that Trump doesn't like.
He stole it. He's been living in their house for years, in half of their house.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that brings us to, so there's a couple ways that I kind of want to segue into that. I also want to discuss what the occupation means, and also, but before I get into that, we have to realize that I want to talk about Baruch Goldstein, and I want to talk about how this society is radicalizing people in a way against Muslims and against Palestinian lives. It holds Palestinian lives in contempt. To be Palestinian here is to live through a series of microaggressions constantly. And part of that comes from the intersections between Islamophobia and Zionism. So something I want to talk about Islamophobia, which should probably more aptly be called anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Muslim racism. Yeah. Islamophobia implies that the person, accidentally is racist. They can't help it. They just grossed out by Muslims or something. But the reality is that this is a form of white supremacy. And the way I would describe it is that there's two main versions of white supremacy. There's those that are based off a physiological hierarchy. In other words, the way you look describes, designates your value in a racial hierarchy. And there's another one that basically is based on cultural hierarchy, basically saying that some cultures are superior and enlightened and others are inherently violent. So they both end in the same direction, whether you go settler colonial cultural hierarchy or you do chattel slavery and physiological hierarchy. They both end in genocide and the exploitation of labor and the theft of land. But what I'm trying to get at here is that Israel's, in Gaza, this is somewhat personal for me because I've lost actually 6 members of my family from the bombings in Gaza, including a 4-year-old girl. Allah yarhamhum jami'an. So what I wanted to say is, how could you possibly justify deliberately killing an unarmed and defenseless civilian population, decimating 2,000 plus individuals in whether it was in 2014 or 2016, vast majority of which were women and children? How do you justify this? So Israel's main MO to dehumanize Palestinians, and that's sort of echoed in the media over here, is Islamophobia. This idea that we're culturally inferior and inherently violent because of our culture. So this not only dehumanizes Palestinians, but it dehumanizes Muslims as a whole. In fact, some of you may be shocked to know that the original author of the anti-Sharia legislation, I think there's 13 states in which we saw sort of the advocacy for anti-Sharia legislation, was a prominent Zionist, prominent American Zionist. So there's this natural intersection between Zionism and Islamophobia. The other thing I want to mention is that Islamophobia and Zionist perception of Palestinians is just sort of a regurgitation of hundreds of years of colonial racism. So when Europeans, kind of made it a habit of massacring much of the world's population, whether it was in Africa, Asia, or South America, we're seeing the rebirth or the, version 2.0 of that logic with Israel's actions. So for example, because by designating Palestinians as inherently violent, any act of violence, whether it's burning down an orphanage or incinerating an elementary school, no matter how perverse or how disgusting or how morally profane or indefensible, Israel will portray it as an act of preemptive self-defense. Oh, well, they were monsters anyway, so, it was us or them. If they would have had the opportunity, they would have attacked us. So we just, got them first. So this is the logic of racially criminalizing the Palestinian people, of constantly, and that's another thing I want to mention. Whenever we mention Palestinian casualties, not only do we primarily speak about them in numbers, we also focus on the women and children. Why? Because Israel operates this Islamophobic narrative that sees all Muslim men between the ages of 14 and 60 as inherently suspect. This idea that we are inherently, again, prone to violence, and it's a racial criminalization of our people. And so we should never forfeit the innocence of Muslim men, whether it's in Palestine or anywhere else in the world. We have to recognize that these are also casualties worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, as a member of the media, I'd like to talk for a minute about media coverage of Palestine. The core purpose of journalism, of a free press, is finding and reporting the truth in order to hold the powerful accountable. Yet for decades, the media abandoned those values in coverage of Israel and Palestine, instead using brand Israel's PR talking points to obscure Israel's systematic oppression of Palestinians and sanitize, as Shaheen was saying, the military occupation and system of apartheid for their audiences. But with the release of the B'Tselem report, titled "This is Apartheid," in January, and the Human Rights Watch report that I referenced earlier, which came out in April, terms like apartheid, persecution, ethnic supremacy are increasingly gaining institutional recognition and are being discussed in public discourse. But the language used in the recent coverage of East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah is a good example of why we need to be vigilant. Media outlets often refer to the forced displacement of Palestinians living there, illegal under international law and potentially a war crime, as evictions. That term misleadingly implies that the issue is a real estate dispute between a tenant and a landlord, and a completely inaccurate depiction of what is actually happening there. In the last days of Ramadan, Israeli forces violently attacked worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque with tear gas, with rubber-tipped bullets. But journalists didn't call it an attack or an assault on Palestinians, but rather a clash, as if both sides shared equal culpability and agency in the escalation. When Israel attacked Gaza, media outlets framed it as a conflict between two equal entities. Under the guise of objectivity, rockets fired at Israel, which caused significantly less damage than Israeli airstrikes, were covered just as much as Israeli dropping bombs and using missiles to attack medical facilities, schools, and Gaza's only COVID testing facility, and leveling residential buildings, clouding, if not ignoring, the total asymmetry in violence and destruction. The human toll caused by Israel's bombardment is indisputable. Hundreds dead, more than 65 children. While statements made by Israeli officials and their defenders justifying the killing of civilians went unchallenged, Palestinian civilians had their humanity interrogated. Journalists asked whether they support violence, whether they support Hamas rockets. The asymmetry in context does not just extend to the language we use. Stories tend to disproportionately amplify Israeli narratives while suppressing Palestinian ones. Friends, we have a responsibility to call out journalists constructively, to implore them to tell the full contextualized truth without fear or favor, to recognize that obfuscating Israel's oppression of Palestinians fails the public, us, that they are there to serve. We are their consumers, and we need to use our power to influence them to get the story right. Letting them continue to whitewash this story is failing our own communities and ultimately failing the Palestinian people. We need to do better.
I'm gonna try to super condense some stuff because I think we got a couple minutes left before Q&A. So one of the things is I wanted to mention, whenever we talk about the occupation is also part of that ethnic cleansing apparatus. That Israel, through a number of ways, tries to get rid of the population. What the occupation does is, by the way, one of the definitions of the international definition on genocide. According to the UN Convention on Genocide, Article 2 says one of the definitions is drastically lowering the quality of life of a people, and that is specifically what the occupation aims to do. So again, Israel has a vision of demographic purity, getting rid of the indigenous population, and one of the ways it achieves that is by making life so unlivable in the occupied territories that people either die a slow cancerous death due to a lack of resources, or they're forced to immigrate at the first opportunity, if there is an opportunity. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that Israel has one of the most impressive propaganda machines in human history. That after the basically slow butchering of a refugee camp entirely populated by women and children in the 1982 invasion of southern Lebanon, with the help of some extremist Lebanese fundamentalists, or I shouldn't say fundamentalists, but yeah, extremist Christian supremacists in Lebanon, it was found that the problem wasn't that Israel was killing Palestinians, is that the killing was visible. And so since then, Israel has invested millions and millions of dollars into PR, into the same organizations that market for Pepsi and Coke to market its own image to the American taxpayer, its patrons.
And there's a name for it.
Yeah.
It's called Hasbara.
Yeah.
Which means explaining. Because Israelis understood that there was going to be things that they do that American audiences and audiences around the world were not going to be okay with. And they realized we need to have people out there to do some explaining.
Yeah, so it's sort of like apartheid South Africa with a Twitter page, or Augusto Pinochet's Argentina with a Facebook group, you know? It's a pariah state with some strong PR. The other thing I also wanted to mention is that there's this misconception about, actually two misconceptions. One of them I wanted to address is that, so you'll probably get this a lot, you know, whenever you advocate for Palestinian human rights, you'll be confronted by apartheid cheerleaders who are going to say, what about Hamas, or what about the rockets? I want you to always understand that that function of that is to derail the conversation, to get you on the defensive, to get the discussion away from the persecution and the suffering of the Palestinian people, to get things away from the 250 civilians that were recently murdered, to get things away from Israel's racial segregation system, to get things away from the ethnic cleansing that is continuously ongoing. And lastly, since we have, I have some stuff that y'all could do. We're going to talk about that right now, but real quick, I just want to mention, there's a local elected official. I wanted to say that there are people here that we have the power to unseat. We decide their fate, who are showing outright contempt for Palestinian people. Okay, one of them is Lou Correa. Lou Correa signed on to a letter requesting more military aid to Israel after it killed Palestinians, okay? This is a man who continuously expresses contempt for our lives with his blind and unequivocal support for the state of Israel. So do what you can. We are a huge force in this area, and we need to organize and we need to recognize our power. And part of the ways you guys can do that is through organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, like CAIR, advocate, reach out to your local elected officials. We can help make that happen. And I have an action alert that I will distribute after this. But Estee, if there's...
Yeah, I just want to say, when they do this thing where they're like, what about Hamas? Or pivot. The art of the pivot. When they ask me about how I feel about rockets and Hamas, I say, you know what? There are 2 million civilians living in Gaza trying to feed their kids and educate them. Let's talk about the fact that they don't have access to clean water, to electricity. Just pivot. Don't get caught up in talking about what they want to talk about. We're here to talk about the people. And just keep that in mind. Don't fall into their traps. I think we're supposed to stop talking. But we're having so much fun. He's saying, yes, stop talking. Is it time to start Q&A? Not yet? Okay. Yes, she's saying yes. The women's always right.
I got you, don't worry. So before we continue onward with our program, first let's get a round of applause for our amazing speakers. I can barely clap properly, but anyways. So we've delved into detail on the history of the Palestinian occupation, and we've connected that to what that looks like today and what is currently taking place in Palestine, which are both super in-depth topics. So I'm sure some of us might have questions regarding what has been discussed. So we have a second mic for the brothers, and we'll be using this mic for the sisters. So if you do have any questions, just keep your hand raised. We'll pass around the mic, and we'll get your questions answered, inshallah. So any questions? Just keep
We got our first question. We got our first question right here.
Assalamu alaikum. I didn't hear you guys talk about the Zionist Christian element in this country.
Sure.
That's like a real problem.
Yep. So, when we think about the Israel lobby, a lot of us, we kind of focus on AIPAC. A big part of the lobby. But long before Jewish Zionism, hundreds and hundreds of years before came Christian Zionism. And the fact of the matter is, the Christian Zionist lobby in this country dwarfs AIPAC. It's so much larger. They have so much more power. So when we saw Trump giving, every item on the Christmas list, it wasn't necessarily Jewish votes he was going after. Were less than 2%. He was doing that for Christian Zionists. He was doing that to keep their votes. Granted, he was happy to get Sheldon Adelson's checks as well, but Christian Zionism is a real problem. And luckily, there are some organizations that are starting to deal with it. It's an issue I keep bringing up on our show on Middle East in Focus. We need to talk about it. We need to learn about it. And it's why, like this weekend, I'm going to a Christian church to talk. And we all need to be aware that when we talk about the lobby, it's not just Jews. It's actually Christian Zionism is a big problem. Organizations like FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America, is a great organization doing work to combat that. But thank you very much for that very, very important question.
Yeah. And I'd also like to add that what's really bizarre about this ideology is that basically there are people who are trying to expedite Yom al-Qiyamah. They're trying to expedite the end of days by fulfilling a prophecy in which Jewish people return to ancient Israel, which, as I mentioned, there's no direct blood relation between the ancient Israelites and the European colonizers. But anyways.
But the
yeah.
end of that story is when, in their story, when Christ comes, if Jews don't convert, we're annihilated. So Christian Zionism is blatantly anti-Semitic. Just to be clear about what is and isn't anti-Semitism.
100%. And also, I'm really curious about, like, at what part is there like a clause in that prophecy that said that they had to create a racially exclusive settler colonial military state? Because I don't think that's part of the deal. But anyways, yeah. But good news is there was a poll that shows that there is actually declining popularity of Israel among younger generations of evangelicals. So hopefully that's a trend that follows through.
In fact, young evangelicals differ from their older counterparts on all the progressive issues, on the environment, on everything. They're really parting ways.
Okay, so we'll take a question from the sister's side, I believe. Here we go.
Hi, so you mentioned that, we have the power to unseat elected officials, but what are some things that we can do to help the situation if we're not of voting age?
That's a really good question.
Organize.
Exactly. That's one of the bigger ones. So for those of y'all who don't know the situation in apartheid South Africa, we have a similar situation, but the numbers were a little bit skewed. You had a 10% European colonial 10% colonial population governing a 90% African indigenous population. And one of the most famous quotes from Stephen Bantu Biko, who was one of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement, is that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. So we are an ummah of, we're almost a fourth or a third of the entire human population. If we organize correctly, even as American Muslims, even if we organize correctly, there is no limit to what we can achieve. And that's not just something I'm throwing out there, as some happy-go-lucky kumbaya. No, I'm being very serious, because all these struggles, our ancestors fought colonizers and won. They fought against insurmountable odds, and they won. And we can do it again.
I just want to say that last week, I'll put numbers on this. Last week, JVP Action, we had our lobby week. We organized about 250 people into over 70 meetings with congressional representatives, their advisors, their staffers, and Senate staffers. And I can't tell you how much those people we met with emphasized the numbers of phone calls and emails and letters that they're getting, and that their bosses would call each day and say, what are the numbers? Call your reps every single week. Every single one of us, at least once or twice a week, should be calling our congressperson, both of our senators, and the White House, because the White House is a problem. This White House is a problem. You don't have to be 18 to make that phone call. And you can say, I can't vote yet, but you better believe I'm not going to vote for someone who supports these policies. The most important thing, the easiest thing that we can do, is to spend 20 minutes every week, I would say twice a week, and call those offices.
Yeah. And also, that's a great suggestion. But also, I felt kind of bad because I kind of gave you a nebulous kind of feel-good answer, but I want to give you some more concrete stuff. So one of the things that you can do is AB 101. It's basically a piece of legislation that rips any discussion of Palestine out of the curriculum because of some racist Zionist reactionary forces. Exactly. So you can reach out to CAIR. Heck, you can reach out to me, and we can help organize a contingent of students. We can organize something. You can be present, when we meet with these elected officials. Another thing is...
just to be clear, AB, that's the Assembly bill. That's California State. That's Sacramento, not D.C.
Yeah. So it's a state California legislation. But that's still impacting the situation. And like she said, all those numbers for these elected officials, you can easily Google them. It takes about 5 minutes. You call, sometimes someone picks up, or you leave a voicemail. The point is, they hear you, and they recognize that there are numbers behind But yeah, there's lots of opportunities, so I would suggest get in touch with organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, CAIR Los Angeles, PYM. There's lots of avenues and ways that you can help, and I can give you more specifics later, but yeah.
And be really polite when you call, because think about it. A lot of the people that work these jobs, they're young people. And how many of us call to say thank you, which we should. If you live in Judy Chu's district, you should call and thank her for co-sponsoring HR 2590, the Palestinian Children and Families Act. But for the rest of us whose Congress people didn't, but when you call like they're doing their job, be polite. They will thank you for your call.
Yep.
Next.
And now we'll get a question from one of the brothers.
What time?
I wanted to mention that, obviously many intellectuals and authors have spoken about this issue, like Edward Said, right? So the idea of like Orientalism and how a lot of dark-skinned and Arabs, Native Americans, indigenous people, we're viewed as savages, and and we're living amongst these like colonial, countries, so to speak, and that's something that I feel like maybe you guys want to talk about, is that like, I mean, I'm trying to phrase a question here where it's really strange how like the whole idea of just Orientalism, where it's like our religion, not just our culture, because you mentioned that, Shaheen, how Arab culture is viewed as like barbaric and backwards. It's the religion, really. Islam is like just painted completely with like the same broad brush as like, these are all savages, these are all,
Well, 100%. So I'm going to very much agree with you on there. Even Edward Said, who's like one of my intellectual heroes, I feel did not go far enough to discuss how Muslims, how basically, like it wasn't just about Arab culture, it was about Islam. And actually, this is like you kind of like struck gold here, man. Like this is something that I talk about all the time, so I appreciate you. But what I was going to say is, yeah, so essentially one of the versions of white supremacy that we're seeing is this idea that there's this like cultural war, like the world is bipolar, it's split right down the middle between the civilized Western civilization, which is the embodiment of sugar, spice, and everything nice, the champion of freedom and liberty and all that good stuff. And Islam actually has for centuries been portrayed as the poster child for tyranny, for oppression, for misogyny. It's very interesting, like despite the fact that none of these claims are based in reality, but yeah, so essentially the way that Palestinians are humanized is through Islam, through the idea that even Christian Palestinians are part of this larger Muslim culture that teaches people to hate. And by the way, so when we're exploring the logic of Israeli Hasbara, their propaganda, we're exploring the logic of genocide. We're exploring colonial racism. And there's this need, I mean, think about it, like these people, whether it's Israeli Zionists or whether it was the Belgian colonizers who were who killed basically 10 million Africans in the Congo. The idea is these people have to sleep at night. So the point is to create your victim, to inverse reality and make your victim look like an existential threat. That, oh, I have to kill this baby, otherwise they're going to kill me first. Or you know what I'm saying? But the main vehicle of that is Islamophobia. And I would love, if you ever want to chat, we could talk more about that.
Anti-Muslim bigotry. We
Yeah.
gotta stop saying Islamophobia.
She's 100% right. Yeah. Anti-Muslim racism. Yeah, 100%.
I would like to add that I think that the term Islamophobia is accurate, because that's really what it is, though. It's hatred of Islam. It's fear of Islam. People always, like anti-Sharia legislation, where it's like these people legitimately are afraid that Islam is going to come and take over America.
It's true, but a phobia is like something, like being afraid of a spider. It's not a phobia. It really is racism.
Yeah. So that's another thing, another misconception about racism. When we talk about racism, people kind of deal it like with an accident. Like, oh, if we just hug this person, they'll realize we're not bad. The reality is that racism is a deliberate ideology. It's usually motivated, it's a political and economic ideology that's usually motivated by profit. So for example, when basically you have American society realized that it could greatly profit off of a virtually free source of labor, we saw all this like pseudo-intellectualism about how black people, in the words of Voltaire, are not men, but rather beasts in the image of man. So, and similarly, when the United States wants to dominate the most non-renewable resource, and it's largely concentrated in a certain area in the world, we start seeing there's a lot of scholarship saying that we're inherently violent and we're in desperate need of military intervention. Essentially, that racism is not an accident, it's not a phobia. And by the way, this isn't necessarily my opinion, it's kind of the consensus of like experts on Islamophobia. But I appreciate what you're saying, that it's a very severe fear and hatred of Muslims.
Right. I know that you're going to have to go pray in a minute, and I just want to say before we run out of time, what an honor it is to come back here and to be here with you guys, and how very special it is for me to be here with Shaheen. Both, I started doing this a little over a decade ago, and one of the first things that I did was we were working with lawyers who were supporting these students from UC Irvine and UC Riverside who went to heckle a political speech. And they were arrested for it, and they were charged under laws that hadn't been used since the 50s. And the DA waited until literally the last day that it was legally possible to charge them. And thank goodness, inshallah, JVP had been on it, and they had organized, and we had collected thousands of signatures, and we got rabbis' letters, and I was sent down to do this press conference. A couple days before that, a wanted poster was left on the front porch of my home about me and naming the small kids in my family by name. And JVP called and said, if you don't want to do, we can find somebody else. And I said, don't be ridiculous. Of course I'm going to go do it. And it was such an amazing gift and honor to get to meet these students, and to get to go to watch the trial, to get to talk to the media, because they were gag ordered, and their families didn't know if they could talk. And so CAIR and other organizations, MPAC, they put together a team of interfaith people to go out and talk to the media. And it was such a great honor to get to support them and to get to be back here 10 years later with Shaheen today.
I just want to say that Estee was kind of like one of our shields. She protected us, she fought for us, and so we greatly appreciate her. And it's an honor for me to share this space with her tonight. And it was like a special treat for me too, it's really cool. And also, I just want to say two more things. BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction, that is the largest global anti-nonviolent movement that is challenging Israeli apartheid. And also, we need solidarity from our Muslim brothers and sisters. Do not join normalizing efforts. Just because it's not necessarily your family in the refugee camps or potentially being bombed in Gaza does not give you permission to sort of like speak on behalf of the Muslim community and sell Palestinians out. Don't join efforts to say like, hey, let's not discuss Palestine. Like, no, please, if you're gonna do solidarity work and if you're gonna do interfaith work, please avoid Zionist and overtly racist organizations. That's all we ask.
Support Palestine and boycott, divest, and demand our government sanction Israel now.
So that would be a couple of final words. Any last words from you two? That's it? Okay. So, yeah, that wraps up tonight's program. So just one key takeaway is that now that we do have a better understanding of what's going on in Palestine, I just want to reiterate what our speakers just noted, that how essential it is that we take action by not only speaking out against the injustices that our Palestinian brothers and sisters are currently facing, but also extending our individual support and solidarity to the Palestinian community in the ways that we can, both offline and online. Never has there been a point in history just like this when we have been so close to freeing Palestine. So continue to keep Palestine in your du'as and do what you can to help. So with that being said, a huge thank you to Estee Chandler and Shaheen Nassar for your guys' time tonight. We really appreciate it. And to those of you guys in the audience as well, who are taking your guys' time off of your guys' Friday nights to learn and do more for your Palestinian brothers and sisters. Give it a round of applause for you guys. So for those of you who do have any more further questions, our speakers will be available after Isha prayer to address them and answer them. So, but a quick announcement. So that wraps up tonight's event. So just be sure to keep on the lookout for future MYG events, Muslim Youth Group, next events. So we do have a fundraiser taking place tomorrow for Gaza with Zakat Foundation. There's actually a table set up outside of the main hall where you can purchase your tickets. And the funds that we'll be raising will go towards both health and food packages that will go towards Palestinian families located in Gaza. So if you are available, please be sure to participate and take part in that. We also have a final family night event scheduled for next Friday, June 18th. Fun night with food, bounce houses, Islamic Jeopardy here at ISOC. So be sure on the lookout for details on that. And with that being said, a huge thank you to each and every one of you again for taking the time off of your guys' Friday nights, coming here to learn more and do more for your Palestinian brothers and sisters. And we'll see you guys at our future events, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala salah, hayya ala al-falah, hayya ala al-falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala salah, hayya ala al-falah, hayya ala al-falah. Qad qamatis salah, qad qamatis salah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. استووا استقيموا. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. فليقاتل في سبيل الله الذين يشرون الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة ومن يقاتل في سبيل الله فيقتل